Sup, kids? This is a piece from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Text of Critical Marxism. Um, this piece is titled by Sean Matgamna, Defend the Soviet Union, question mark. I believe that the original, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's what it's titled in the actual Workers' Party internal bulletin that this piece is from, but it says excerpts from a letter to a West Coast comrade from a Workers' Party internal bulletin, August 1941. So let's go. I should like to try to make as plain and convincing as possible the position I hold on the present stage of the war, with particular reference to Russia. Some comrades argue that the character of the war has changed. Others even quote the article I wrote for the New International a few months ago, which says in effect that if the character of the war should change, then we should be for the defense of the Soviet Union, whether it is attacked by one or more imperialist powers. While I still hold to that, the quoters are obliged to prove that the character of the war, that is, its predominant character, for there is no such thing as a war which is, quote, purely one thing or another, has changed. Here it must be said that the Canaanites are more consistent than some of our own defensists, and although B is evidently losing all his bearings from his point of view, it nevertheless makes sense when he now says that the Canaanites are right now and were right a year and a half ago. On the principal arguments of the Canaanites at the judging of the war was that it did not matter who fired the first shot, because you cannot, and it is not necessary to decide between the quote aggressor and quote defender in a war. From a military point of view, this is of course unassailable. Therefore, they could be for the defense of the Soviet Union when Stalin invaded Poland, the Baltic, Finland, and the Balkans in anticipation of the next stage of the war, in which the conquest resulting from these invasions would serve as defensive outposts protecting the Soviet Union when it is attacked. In other words, if it is correct to defend the Soviet Union now, in the second stage of the war, then it was correct to defend it 20 months ago, and we would have to say that the genial Stalin showed a lot of foresight in providing himself in advance with protective armoring he acquired during the initial invasions. And summa summarum, that is now the big trump card Stalin's apologists are playing in this country. To a lot of simple people that even sounds convincing. For supporters of the Stalin regime, this argument is and should be enough. And if I were such a supporter, all the petty lies and deceptions of Stalin would then recede into 20th place. Some of our comrades, however, fail to take into account that we are the revolutionary enemies of that regime. We are not its advisors. We are not out to reform it. We are out to overthrow it. We must therefore judge its, quote, aggressive and, quote, defensive measures not from a military, but from a social and political standpoint. We subordinate the former to the latter. The Canaanites subordinate the latter to the former. Example, they said the invasion of Poland or of Finland was a blow in the world revolution, that it was shameful and criminal. Presumably it was shameful and criminal primarily from a political and not a military standpoint. But, they said, they were for the defense of Russia. That is, for the victorious execution of this shame, this crime, this blow at the world revolution, because it was militarily successful. We said there is no conceivable abstraction in this world, not even the talk about nationalized property, that can get us to defend a blow against the world revolution, and a shameful and criminal blow at that. We refused to be defensists because the Soviet Union was engaged in a reactionary war. Did that mean that the nationalized property of Russia was not at stake in the war? Of course it was. Would the fact that Leningrad would be more heavily protected if Stalin got southern Finland help defend the nationalized property if Russia were attacked at a later stage? Of course it would. Isn't it also a fact that in the conquered territory Stalin abolished bourgeois property and nationalized it? Of course it is. But our basic criterion is the interest of the world proletariat and the international revolution. Stalin's war struck the most brutal blows at these interests. And, we said with Trotsky, the nationalization of property in the occupied territories does not compensate for these blows by 1/10. Just exactly what were these blows? 1. Capitulation to German imperialism. 2. The joint imperialist subjugation of the conquered territories, which should now be clear to anybody after the disclosures of Hitler and von Ribbentrop a couple months ago, was deliberately decided upon in advance and by agreement between the two bandits. 3. The political alliance between Stalin and Hitler, as exemplified, among other things, by Stalin's whitewashing of Hitler's war and of Hitler's peace. 4. The fact that Stalin drove the workers of Finland and of other countries, Germany and the United States included, deeper into the arms of the bourgeoisie. 5. Their bourgeoisies. 5. That Stalin's army and GPU immediately suppressed all genuine revolutionary and Soviet manifestation of the masses in the territories he invaded, and so on. All these either constituted or followed inescapably from the character of the war in which Stalin was engaged. We never condemned Stalin just because Stalin and not the Finnish or Polish bourgeoisie fired the first bullet or because he was the first one to cross a boundary line. Now let us see what has changed. The bureaucracy is now defending its imperialist conquest of a year and a half or more ago. We were against the Stalin bureaucracies acquiring these conquests. Why should we defend it when it seeks to retain these conquests? We said with Trotsky, quote, "We are and remain against seizures of new territories by the Kremlin," end quote. Why should we be for the Stalinists holding these territories after they have seized them? The Stalinists have changed imperialist camps. That is of great importance, but by no means of principal importance. In 1939 and 1940, their alliance with and subjugation to German imperialism drove the workers into the arms of the bourgeoisie. I contend that their alliance with Anglo-American imperialism in 1941 drives the workers into the arms of the bourgeoisie at least as much. The objective consequences of the bureaucracy's war in 1939 was the victory of one imperialism, now of another imperialism. But isn't the nationalized property, which is not bourgeois, quote, really at stake in 1941, as was not the case in 1939? Allow me to return to the question at a later point. Right now I want to deal with the question of the famous, quote, mixed war. We used to speak a great deal in our movement, before the war broke out, of the, quote, mixed war. It aroused in connection with the Stalin-Laval Pact in 1935, and it meant this. If Russia and France are allied in a war against Germany, that would make it an imperialist war on the one side but not on the other. We cannot stand still in our own conceptions or be bound by the fetishism of words or memories. We must allow life to influence our conceptions. Life has proved that the degenerate Stalinist regime cannot fight a, quote, mixed war as a progressive or revolutionary war. By its very nature, its agreements and alliances without quotation marks this time, with imperialism and reactionary through and through. So let me repeat that. It felt weird coming out of my mouth. By its very nature, its agreements and alliances without quotation marks this time, with imperialism are reactionary through and through. And that again brings us to the character of the present war and the character of Russia's participation in it, even the present stage of the war. Again and again I repeat, we must judge our position of defeatism or defensism in any country by the interests of the socialist world proletariat, and not of the workers of one country. The victory of German imperialism in the war would have nothing but reactionary effects. The victory of Anglo-American imperialism over Germany likewise. We are for the defeat of German imperialism, not by Anglo-American imperialism but by the German proletariat. We are for the defeat of the British Empire, but not by Hitler. From the standpoint of our basic criterion, what are the objective consequences of, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, now? Taken on a world scale, and that is the only way we can take it. Since we are not Russian nationalists, it means the imperialist victory of Washington and London over German imperialism, with all the tragic consequences that flow from that. The victory of Stalin in Poland was undoubtedly a, quote, victory for nationalized property, end quote, if considered as an isolated national phenomenon. In the realities of present world politics and the present world war, however, this victory is a victory of German imperialism over its rivals. That is the fact, and even children ought to know it. The same is true of the invasion of Finland. Trotsky said it was carried out at the dictates of Hitler. Correct. Did it help protect Leningrad? Of course. But from the international point of view, which is decisive, the invasion was a necessary part of the war strategy of German imperialism. What has changed now is that concretely, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, means promoting the grand strategy of Anglo-American imperialism, objectively to be sure, hence the dilemma of the defensists. I mean, of course, a revolutionary defensists like some of our comrades in the Canaanites. What concretely do they propose to do that we do not propose? I would like very much to hear that. In 1935 to 36, we used to say that in the hypothetical mixed war, we would be for facilitating shipments to Russia, but not to France or Germany. In the present real and not hypothetical war, I ask the following question of the defensists. Are you for facilitating American shipments to Russia today? Alas, the accursed realities of war show that shipments to Russia mean convoys, and that convoys, as our good president says, mean a shooting war. Is that a fact or not? Even Goldman is compelled to acknowledge this in The Militant. He tries to get around the dilemma by the poor lawyer's argument that he doesn't, quote, urge shipments, because that means convoys and they mean war, but his party will not oppose them. Isn't that a beauty of a position? Or will the defensists be proposing, for example, tomorrow, that we demonstrate before the Japanese consulates if hostilities break out between Japan and Russia? I doubt it, because even now they understand that such demonstrations, given the real and not hypothetical situation, would only be grist to the mill of American imperialism. Or what will they do in the not all inconceivable situation which may confront them tomorrow morning, so to speak, where British and Russian troops are fighting side by side in Afghanistan or Iran? Where do the British troops end and the Russians begin? Where does defensism end and non-defensism begin? Every intelligent observer knows that this is an entirely practical and immediate possibility. And where are the revolutionary compensations for the inevitably reactionary effects of Stalin's war? Compensations which the Lenin-Trotsky regime could and did provide for. They do not exist, and in the nature of the case cannot. What about the workers in the Soviet Union? What about the defense of nationalized property? Nationalized property is not an abstraction any more than democracy is an abstraction. Nationalized property under the regime of Soviet democracy, that was a revolutionary worker state. The nationalized property with the regime of the anti-Soviet autocracy, whether you call it a degenerated worker state or bureaucratic collectivism, is certainly not equivalent to a revolutionary worker state. On the basis of this very same nationalized property, in fact, during the very period when this property was consolidated and expanded enormously at the expense of bourgeois property, the proletarian and revolutionary movements in Russia were all but completely destroyed and the international proletarian movement frightfully undermined. As you know, I consider nationalized property in the Soviet Union a historically superior form of property to any form of property in history. I want to repeat that just because that seems like it's important for clarifying Shachtman's position. As you know, I consider nationalized property in the Soviet Union a historically superior form of property to any form of private property in history, but I do not attribute to it what Marx would call a superhistorical significance, any more than, for example, I would attribute such a significance to democracy. Is it worth defending? That depends on concrete circumstances, and not upon evaluation of nationalized property in and of itself. It is dangerous to argue by analogy because people can easily demonstrate that analogous situations are not identical situations. Yet to argue by analogy is often illuminating. In the Spanish Civil War, there were elements of imperialist war, and we pointed them out. But we said, the war is decisively between bourgeois democracy and fascism, and given the fact that the proletariat was not ready to take power in its own name, we supported bourgeois democracy against fascism, critically to be sure. In the same manner, in a social war between world capitalism and the Soviet Union, I would be a revolutionary, i.e. a critical defensist in Russia, because I do not want to see world imperialism get a new lease on life by reducing the non-capitalist Soviet Union to a capitalist colony. Isn't the nationalized property at stake in the present war too? Of course it is. But isn't the working class movement in the United States, its rights and institutions, and in England too, also at stake in the present war? That is, if Hitler conquers the United States, would that not mean that in addition to the crushing of American imperialism, the working class movement, and the more or less democratic basis on which it can exist and progress, would also be destroyed? Of course it would. Yet, we are not defensists in the United States because, however important the role this element plays, it does not alter the decisive imperialist and reactionary character of the war. But at the same time, even in the United States, We do not take a completely negative position. Without becoming defensist or even flirting with defensism, we fight right in the midst of the imperialist war itself for interests and rights of the working class. We fight to advance that which is worth defending. In the present situation in Russia, I would apply much the same policy. Would I tell the Russian workers not to fight the war? That advice is meaningless or stupid. I could not and do not tell them that in the United States. Do I tell them in Russia not to obey their officers? Of course not. I am not an anarchist. In Russia and anywhere else, the workers and especially the soldiers will obey their superiors until they have accumulated the organized power, ... Not to obey if they so desire. In the Soviet Union, now, what would I fight for? You understand, of course, that, quote, fighting for, end quote, anything in the Soviet Union today is, so far as our movement is concerned, a work of, quote, patient enlightenment, end quote, as Lenin used to put it. I would say to the workers, organize and mobilize your strengths to reestablish the Soviets, in the cities, in the army, and on the land, to reestablish your trade unions, to take power again, to drive out the bureaucrats. Demand even now the diminution and eventual abolition of all bureaucratic privileges. Demand the release of the revolutionary opponents of Stalin who were imprisoned. Demand the right of self-determination for the Ukraine. I noticed that the Kennonites dropped this slogan out of their program of action for Russia, and so on. Finally, it's necessary to have a little more clarity on the question of defeatism. You remember in the Socialist Workers' Party dispute, the gifted Marxist, Cannon, explained to us that the Leninist theory of defeatism means that you prefer the victory of the enemy to the victory of your own government. That is, you prefer the defeat of your country by the enemy country to the defeat of the enemy country by your country. Of course, Lenin never had such an idea, but trifles like that have never bothered Cannon in his theoretical flights. I personally think that so much confusion has been introduced in the concept of defeatism that I doubt if we would be losing too much if we dropped the word out of our vocabulary. However, be that as it may, let me try to specify what I mean by the content of this conception in the present situation. I am not for throwing open the front so that Hitler can march in. Not at all. For that matter, in a considerably different situation, and for somewhat different reasons, I'm not for throwing open the front in England either. By defeatism in Russia, I may still use that word. I aim at the defeat of the Stalinist counter-revolution by the Soviet working class. Right now, to talk realistically of revolutionary actions which endanger the front is phrase-mongering, playing with formulae, and nothing more. If a situation called for, quote, patient explanation, is the present situation in Russia, to the extent that anything can be done in Russia, I would seek to direct the efforts of the internationalists of reconstituting the independence and integrity of the proletariat. Then one of two things. This would either facilitate the development of a favorable revolutionary situation, or else would be facilitated by the development of such a situation. More accurately, the one would influence the other. After such an independent proletariat became strong enough to have an influence on the front and on the military operations, then, given the continued existence of the Stalin regime, you would have the beginnings of the dual power in Russia. In that case, without yet becoming a defensist, while continuing to denounce Stalin's reactionary war and reactionary war aims, I would try to appeal to the soldiers as Lenin did in 1917, not to engage in futile mutinies or riots or in any sporadic actions, to hold the front, so that the Germans do not break through and crush the proletarian elements of the dual power, and to speed the day when the Russian proletariat can crush the Stalinist elements of the dual power, and change the war into a revolutionary war against imperialism. I know that among certain comrades in the party, a tiny minority, I hope, there is what you might call a reactionary mood about the famous, quote, Russian question. In their fury at Stalin and Stalinism and the Stalinists, some comrades are seeking some magic formula which will, quote, rid them of the Russian problem, end quote, and of Stalinism. I am firmly in favor of resisting and counteracting such moods of desperation, because that is all they are. It is even reported to me that one comrade said that he is a, quote, defeatist in Russia, because you see, if Russia is defeated, we don't have the problem of Stalinism in the unions anymore. I cannot, of course, vouch for the accuracy of this remark, but I hardly need say that I have nothing in common with such a point of view. I can understand such a point of view only as a result of a reaction provoked by the hideousness of Stalinism, and perhaps to a lesser degree by the same extremist statements by defensists. It is necessary to be on guard against such extreme reactions, because even the best comrades, once they start on that road, will sure as fate go to hell. I appeal, rather, for the calmest and most objective judgment of the problem. I don't for a moment contend that it is a simple problem. For the Stalinists, of course, it is simple. They don't even have to think about it. Anything Stalin does automatically merits support. For the Canaanites, too, it is pretty simple. Any war that the, quote, nationalized property, end quote, fights against capitalism, they defend it. The present Soviet state, said Trotsky, is a terrible monstrosity. It was never thought of or conceived of by Marx or Engels or Lenin or Trotsky himself. It is unprecedented and unique and full of startling surprises and innovations. I consider it the height of stupidity to believe that every single problem connected with it can be answered by a simple formula. For my part, I'm ready to leave that travesty of Marxian politics to the Canaanites. The end. Thank you for listening.